So as we get ready to begin this evening, I just want to give a brief recap of what the other 2 weeks have looked like for us. Let me get this in my pocket. The other 2 weeks, as we're looking at the story of Jonah, the first week we looked at this idea of running away from God, and I talked about packing up my red wagon and running away, and I didn't make it very far. I made it kind of around the block and came back, and there was my grandmother. She had lunch ready for me, and she knew exactly what I needed. And I said that that's exactly how it is with God, that we kind of have this decision that in life when things get difficult, we can pack up our wagons and run away, or we can run into the arms of God who knows exactly what we need. And last week we kind of looked at this storm that was taking place. That in the midst of these experienced sailors who are terrified of what's going on because the storm is supernatural and they're throwing things overboard, Jonah's just kind of sleeping away in the cabin. And so then they cast lots and all the signs point to Jonah being the problem. And Jonah kind of has this decision to make of what to do, and that's where we'll pick up tonight. But I offered the reminder last week that the God that throws this storm in is the God that can calm the storms that take place in your life. That God is a God who takes care of you in the midst of difficulties. So as we pick up from the story from last week, I'll read verse 12 again. He said to them, "Pick me up and hurl me into the sea. Then the sea will quiet down for you. For I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you." So finally, Jonah admits fault. It kind of reminds me of, if you're a parent, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about, or maybe you'll remember from when you were a child. You hear your parents call your name, and you know what you did, but you're going to try to outsmart them, right? So they look at you and say, "Josh, did you do this?" "No, I have no idea how that happened." And then they pull out like the list of reasons why they know that you did it. And they're like, "Well, the TV was knocked over. There was no one else home. We know," so on and so forth. "Do you want to change your answer?" And then you're like, "Yeah, sorry about that." That's kind of the case with Jonah. And he's finally like, "Yeah, so I know I was sleeping and everything, but sorry about that. I know you're kind of in this situation. It's my fault. So sorry about that." Story continues, verse 13. "Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get back to dry land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more difficult against them." So the word that we have translated as rowing hard is literally translated as a hollowing out. And so this is how crazy the seas are, that they are literally trying to hollow out the water. I mean, they are up against a very fierce storm. And so their idea is, and I don't know that they necessarily believe Jonah. When Jonah's like, "Toss me overboard," they're like, I don't know. I mean, you probably have a couple of questions for Jonah, right? First, Jonah, do you really think this is a good idea? Second, why would we need to do this? Because it's ultimately going to result in your death. And so they decide, well, we're going to try to make it to dry land. So as they're trying to make it to dry land, the storm is just so bad that they can't even get there. So they have to give up. And so I'm sure they just kind of give Jonah this look like, "Well, we tried, but you're going overboard." Verse 14. Therefore they called out to the Lord, O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood, for you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you. Now, when they call out to God, they call out to Yahweh, which is Jonah's God, our God. And they're calling out to Jonah's God, they're praying to Jonah's God because they have an understanding of Hebrew laws. We talked last week that Jonah, they give Jonah, the sailors, they give him this intense interrogation. And they're like, who are you? Where did you come from? What is your occupation? And Jonah's response is, I'm Jonah, I'm a Hebrew. So they have an idea, and then Jonah explains who his God is. And so they have an idea about his rituals and customs. And one thing that they know about the Israelite law is that killing an innocent person is one of the most heinous crimes that you can commit. I mean, that really hasn't changed in today's times, has it? Right? I mean, we don't really like people going around killing innocent people. It's not a good thing. And so they don't want to be responsible for this. They don't want the blood on their hands. And so they're talking with God and they're saying, God, we understand what you want to do. It sounds kind of crazy, but please don't punish us for this. This is what we're supposed to do. So they're calling out to God. Verse 15. So they picked up Jonah and they hurled him into the sea. And the sea ceased its raging. So they take Jonah, throw him overboard. Good luck, buddy. There's a bunch of cargo that we threw out. Maybe you can catch some of that. But as soon as they do that, the storm stops. And they're on calm waters again. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. Remember how I had said last week that Jonah talked about how he feared God, that he worshiped God, that he had this great reverence for God, but none of his actions really led us to believe that? Well, the sailors are using the same phrase of fear here, except on a higher level. And these people who had no idea who God is have now become followers. The people that had no idea of who God is, God took the impossible and gave them faith. And they're so convinced by what they've seen, and it's probably amazing as you look across the timeline, they experience this storm that they've like nothing they've ever experienced in their life. And they're in the midst of calling out to God. And the God that they're calling out to, Jonah's God, our God, is the only one that actually listens. And then they see everything just come to a calming stop. That's proof right in front of their eyes. And it's good enough for them. So much so that they offer up a sacrifice, which is very likely because they kept animals on these boats because they need to eat. But it also says that they make a vow. They become followers. Until we get to verse 17. We've had a couple of characters, right? We have this boat, we have God, we have Jonah, we have these sailors, we have a captain, we have those terrible people over in Nineveh. We got a couple of different characters. But now the most famous character enters the scene. Verse 17. And the Lord appointed, the Lord sent a great fish to swallow up Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. God provides for Jonah. Not in a way that I think Jonah would have drawn up. The crazy thing about this whole story is, really the only reason we remember Jonah is why? He gets swallowed by a fish, right? The whole point of the story of Jonah gets lost in Jonah because we have this fish that enters the scene and he steals the show. The whole point of Jonah is that God's mercy and love is there for all, even for those that Jonah or you and I don't like. That's what God is trying to say through the book. God is so determined, and God takes this gentleman that decides he's going to run away, and over again shows mercy and grace to Jonah. For those of you who are parents, how happy did it make you when your kids decided not to listen to you? Like just clearly not listen to you. It happened more than you like, and it probably didn't make you very happy. But part of being a parent is having grace with your child, isn't it? Having understanding with your child, isn't it? Giving them the benefit of the doubt so that way they can still grow up and they can learn from it. And that's exactly what God does. In silence is how God does it. Now I want to close out with this. In life, there will be times that you feel that God is silent. I've experienced them. I'm sure that you sitting here have experienced them, where you're praying, and it feels like God isn't listening. You wonder if it's even worth it to continue to keep praying. Well, there's a gentleman named Ron Edmondson, and I'm all about, if there's someone who communicates a message better than I could, giving them credit and giving you the work that they've done. So what I invite you to do is I invite you to write these 5 points down. Because these are what Ron says we need to keep in mind when we go through those dark and silent times. First is don't ignore the silence. And that's often what we do during these times, isn't it? We shut everything out. We shut everyone out, God included, because it's silent. And we don't want to sit in silence. We live in America where silence is not something that we're used to, right? Especially people from my generation, a younger generation. Whenever I'm doing the dishes, even taking a shower, when I'm cleaning, everything I'm doing, I either have music on or a podcast on. Why? I can't stand silence.
And I like silence.
Well, that's good. When I read my Bible in the morning, I have praise and worship music on.
Silence.
You like silence. And I do think that partially it's a generational thing. Look at all that people in my generation for years have had at their fingertips. Right? It just comes naturally to us. We sit down in front of a computer, boom, 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 we can really do anything. Except talk to somebody. Exactly. Don't ignore the silence. Second, go back to what you know. And what Ron says is that so often what we want to do in those times where we feel that God is silent is close our Bibles, shut down our prayer life, and go into hiding. That we want to go into these times where we become self-reliant instead of God-reliant. It's not that God has left, it's just that God is teaching through the silence. So go back to what you know. Third, the most difficult one, trust more and not less. There's an extremely personal example that I've had within the last year, and I'm not going to go into the details. But it took a situation where I really felt that God was being silent. And it was really, really hard to keep my faith. I'm like, I'm a pastor, I got to lead people. People rely on me. But it wasn't until God answered the prayer in God's timing, not mine, that I began to understand. And as I look back, I can see how much God was teaching me through that silence. In fact, it's put me in a position where I feel so much better off having been through that silence period. And in fact, God wasn't absent. God was just silent and had a silent presence. I just had to learn. Fourth, listen and watch closely. God is working. I believe that we worship a God that works, a God that's living, a God that is active. Listen in the silence and watch what's going around. Lastly, get ready to receive. God works. When I was younger, I lost a good friend of mine. A friend that I played hockey with all the time. His name's Chris. Never forget the day when my dad told me at breakfast that Chris had died. He was run over by a car. And just not that long afterwards, because the Methodist Church is the itinerant system, my dad got moved from Audubon to Millville. And then not long after that, we lost my grandfather. And I went into a very, very dark place. I was a very unhappy teen, particularly my freshman and sophomore years. I had a very difficult time because I felt like that there was silence. I wasn't ready to receive the lesson. But you know what the lesson was? I began to understand what unconditional love looks like through the eyes of my parents. Because my parents, no matter as difficult as I made life for them, they loved me, they supported me, and they were there for me. Be ready to receive whatever that lesson is. Because we're a lot like Jonah. And we have to learn lessons in life that we really don't want to learn. So we need to be ready. And just because God seems to be far away, God doesn't seem to be listening, God is just utilizing the silence for a lesson. And we're better off for listening to the silence moving forward. Amen.